The lantern had burned low, casting amber shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the abandoned relay station, when Sallie Boone finally stopped pretending she was not terrified. She had been holding herself together for 6 hours. 6 hours since the ambush on the Cimarron Road. 6 hours since she had watched the stagecoach driver take a bullet and the horses scatter into the dark scrubland. 6 hours since she had crawled through broken glass and splinters and pressed herself into the hollow under a dead man's wagon, counting the seconds between gunshots and praying to a God she was not entirely sure still listened to a woman like her. And now she was here, in this crumbling station house on the edge of nowhere, somewhere north of the New Mexico territory border, in the autumn of 1882, and the man sitting across from her on the dirt floor was a wanted outlaw named Andrew Underwood. She had recognized his face from the poster nailed to the wall of the Springer Sheriff's office 3 weeks ago. Dark eyes, strong jaw, a scar running from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, thin and silver as a wire. The poster had called him dangerous. It had used the word ruthless. It had offered $300 for his capture, dead or alive. What the poster had not mentioned was that he had pulled her out of that hollow under the wagon with his bare hands, taken a graze across his forearm doing it, and then half-carried her 4 miles across open desert in the dark without once complaining. He sat now with his back against the opposite wall, his long legs stretched before him, his hat tilted low. He was watching her, she realized. He had been watching her for some time, watching the way she kept clenching and unclenching her hands in her lap. The way her jaw was set so tight it had to hurt. The way she was staring at the lantern flame as though if she broke eye contact with it, something terrible would happen. She felt his gaze the way you feel the approach of a storm, specific and inevitable. "You have been awake for how many hours?" he said finally. His voice was quiet, not gentle exactly but careful, the way a man speaks when he knows he is dealing with something that might shatter. "I am fine," she said. He did not argue with that. He simply looked at her for another long moment, and then he said the 7 words that undid her completely. "You do not have to be brave right now." Sallie Boone had not cried since she was 9 years old. She cried now. She pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and she cried in long, silent, shaking waves, and Andrew Underwood did not move toward her, did not offer false comfort, did not tell her everything would be all right. He simply stayed. He stayed through all of it, quiet and present and real, and when it was finally over he handed her his canteen without a word, and that was the moment, though she would not understand it until much later, that she lost her heart to an outlaw. But to understand how Sallie Boone came to be crying on a dirt floor in an abandoned relay station while a wanted man watched over her, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the day she arrived in Springer, New Mexico territory, with $17, a carpet bag, and a secret that could get her killed. She had come west because she had no choice. That was the truth of it, plain and unadorned. The kind of truth you stop dressing up after a while because the dress never fits right anyway. Her father, Thomas Boone, had been a cattle broker in Dodge City, Kansas, a respected man, a deacon of the church, a man who shook other men's hands with both of his and looked them straight in the eye. He had also, Sallie discovered after his death in the spring of 1882, been deeply in debt to a man named Cutter Driscoll, who ran a trading operation out of Santa Fe that was less concerned with the legality of what it traded than with the profit margin. Thomas Boone had borrowed money from Driscoll to cover losses from a bad cattle season 3 years running. He had borrowed more to cover the interest on what he had borrowed before. And then he had died of a fever in March, and Cutter Driscoll had arrived at the Boone house in Dodge City 4 days after the funeral with 2 large men behind him, and a very specific accounting of what the Boone family now owed him. Sallie's mother had died when Sallie was 12. There were no brothers, no uncles of standing, no family with resources to speak of. There was only Sallie, 24 years old, with her father's ledger books and his debts, and a house that Driscoll now informed her was collateral he intended to collect. He had given her a choice. She could sign the house over immediately and leave Dodge City with nothing, or she could come to Santa Fe and work for him to pay off the balance of what her father owed. He had smiled when he said it, which was worse than if he had not smiled. She understood perfectly what working for Driscoll in Santa Fe meant. She had smiled back. She had told him she needed a week to settle her father's affairs. She had spent that week copying out every entry in her father's ledger that she could decipher, particularly the ones that recorded not just what Thomas Boone had borrowed from Driscoll, but what Driscoll had been doing with the profits of his operation. Her father had been meticulous. His guilt, perhaps, had expressed itself as record-keeping. What she had copied out was enough to put Cutter Driscoll in a federal prison. It was also, she understood with cold clarity, enough to get her killed if Driscoll ever found out she had it. She had sewn the papers into the lining of her carpet bag and taken the first stage south and west, toward the office of a federal marshal she had heard her father mention once, a man named Hollis Crane who worked out of Springer and who was, her father had said, one of the few honest lawmen left in the territory. She had been 3 days out of Dodge City when the stage from Raton to Springer was ambushed on the Cimarron Road. Springer in 1882 was a town that had not quite decided what it wanted to be. It sat on the Cimarron River in Colfax County, in the northeastern part of the New Mexico Territory, surrounded by grasslands and mesa country that stretched away in every direction like a question without an answer. The cattle trade had put it on the map. The Maxwell land grant troubles had kept it interesting and dangerous. Men came through Springer going everywhere and nowhere, and the town had learned to ask very few questions about any of them. Andrew Underwood had come to Springer 3 months before Sallie Boone arrived, and he had come for his own complicated reasons, none of which appeared on his wanted poster. The poster told the truth, in the way that wanted posters tell truth, which is to say it told the facts without the context that would make those facts comprehensible. Yes, Andrew Underwood was wanted in Colorado for robbery. Yes, he had ridden with the Draper outfit for 2 years. Yes, he had a record going back to 1878 that read like a catalog of bad decisions. What the poster did not say was that every robbery he had committed with the Draper outfit had been against targets chosen by a man named Cutter Driscoll, who contracted with the Draper gang for services that required deniability. What it did not say was that Andrew had left the Draper outfit 8 months ago, when he realized that the job they were being asked to do in Trinidad, Colorado, involved killing a family, not robbing them. What it did not say was that he had spent the last 8 months trying to find a way out of a life that had closed around him like a trap before he was old enough to understand what a trap was. He had come to Springer because he had heard, through the particular underground telegraph of men who live outside the law, that Federal Marshal Hollis Crane was a man who sometimes dealt in information. That sometimes, if what you brought him was valuable enough, he could make arrangements. Andrew had information about Cutter Driscoll's operation that was considerably more specific than anything a federal marshal would otherwise have access to. He was trying to negotiate a future for himself. It was a thin thread, and he knew it, but thin was better than none. He had been watching Marshal Crane's office for 3 weeks, trying to determine the right moment to approach without getting himself arrested on sight, when the news came in that the Raton stage had been ambushed on the Cimarron Road. Andrew had been in the livery stable on the south end of Springer's Main Street, sharing a stall with his horse and a week's worth of careful thought, when he overheard 2 men talking in the adjacent stall about the ambush. One of the men said there had been a woman on the stage. The other man shrugged and said she was probably dead. Andrew had saddled his horse and ridden north before he had formed a coherent reason for doing so. He found the wreckage of the stage just before midnight. The driver was dead. The 2 other passengers, both men, were gone, either fled or taken. The woman was under the wagon, pressed into the earth like she was trying to become part of it, and she came out fighting when he reached for her, which he had not expected, and which, later, he would think of as the first thing he had loved about her. She had clawed at his wrist and told him in a voice like cut glass that she would not go anywhere with anyone until she knew who they were and what they wanted. He had told her his name without thinking. He had told her he wanted to get her somewhere safe, which surprised him slightly because it was true. And she had looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said, "Andrew Underwood, I have seen your poster. You had better be exactly as dangerous as they say, because whoever ambushed this stage is still out there." He had taken that as consent and gotten her out of there. The relay station was 4 miles north across open country. It had been abandoned since the spring when the relay company lost its contract with the stage line. Andrew knew it because he knew most of the unmapped and forgettable places in a 40-mile radius of Springer. That was the kind of knowledge a man accumulated when he needed to know where to disappear. He had built a fire in the ruined hearth, small enough to be invisible from outside. He had given her what remained of his water and the last of the dried beef he carried in his saddlebag. He had dressed the graze on his forearm himself, quickly and without ceremony, when she offered to help, which she had done in the tone of a woman who was accustomed to being useful and resented the implication that she needed to be managed. And then they had sat across from each other in the lantern light while the night settled around the station like a held breath, and he had watched her hold herself together with a discipline he recognized because he had spent years doing the same thing for entirely different reasons. And eventually he had said what he said, and she had cried, and then they had talked for a very long time. She told him about her father, about Driscoll, about the papers sewn into her carpet bag. She told him because she was exhausted, and because something about the way he had said those words had made her feel, for the first time in months, that she was not entirely alone in something terrible. She told him more than she had intended to, and when she was done she felt the fear come back, not of him but with him, because she had just handed a stranger who lived outside the law the most dangerous secret she carried, and now everything depended on what kind of stranger he turned out to be. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he told her about Driscoll, about the Draper outfit, about Trinidad. He told her carefully and precisely, the way a man tells something he has been carrying alone for a long time and has finally found someone capable of bearing the weight of it. He told her that he had come to Springer to find Holly's crane, that the information he had was the kind that put men in federal courts, that he was trying to buy himself a future with it. She looked at him for a very long time when he finished. "So we are both here to see Marshal Crane," she said. "Yes. And we both have evidence against the same man. It would appear so." She was quiet for a moment and he watched her think. He could see it happening behind her eyes, the quick, careful assessment of angles and outcomes. He had the impression of a mind that worked very fast and trusted itself. "That makes our evidence considerably more compelling together than separately," she said. "It does. Which means we have a mutual interest in getting each other safely to Marshal Crane's office." "I had already come to that conclusion," he said. She nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had suspected. "Then I suppose we had better figure out how to do that." They talked through the rest of the night, not always about practical things. The fire burned lower and the lantern oil slowly diminished, and somewhere in the small hours of the morning, the conversation drifted from plans and contingencies to other things. He told her about growing up in the eastern Colorado territories, the second son of a failed homesteader who had eventually lost everything to drought and debt, and just kept moving west the way men did when they ran out of better options. He told her that he had been 17 when he first rode with men who took what they needed rather than waiting on an economy that seemed specifically designed to ensure they never had anything worth waiting for. She told him about her mother, who had taught herself to read and then taught Sallie the same way, with books borrowed from anyone who had them and returned in better condition than they had been lent. She told him about the ledger books and how she had spent her father's last years helping him keep them, and how she had understood his business better than he had known she understood it, and how that understanding was the thing that had saved her, and also condemned her to this particular moment in an abandoned relay station with a wanted man. "You did not have to do any of this," he said at one point. "You could have signed the house over and walked away, started somewhere else." "Walk away and let him do the same thing to the next family he finds," she said. "No, I could not do that." He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. It was something between admiration and a kind of private reckoning, as though she had said something that required him to revise an opinion he had not known he held. Dawn came the color of old brass, and with it came the immediate practical problem of getting to Springer without being seen by whoever had ambushed the stage. Andrew's horse was a good animal, a dark bay gelding named simply Horse, which had been his compromise between sentimentality and practicality when he had acquired him 2 years ago. Horse was strong and sensible. He could carry double. "There is the obvious difficulty," Andrew said, "that the moment I walk into Springer, particularly if I walk in with a woman who just survived a stage robbery, someone is going to recognize me, and the situation will become complicated." "I will go in first," Sallie said, "to Marshal Crane's office. I will tell him what I have. I will tell him that I have a partner who has additional information and who is willing to cooperate in exchange for consideration of his circumstances. Crane deals in information, as you said. He will understand the proposition." Andrew looked at her steadily. "You are asking me to trust you to negotiate on my behalf with a federal marshal while I wait outside town?" "Yes, we have known each other for approximately 7 hours. "I know," she said, "but you already know everything I have to lose if I betray you because I told you last night. And I think you are smart enough to understand that my best chance of coming out of this with my life intact is to get Driscoll behind federal bars as quickly as possible, and I cannot do that without your testimony." She paused. "Also, I think you are not a bad man, Andrew Underwood. I think you made bad choices and got trapped in them. But the man who could have left me under that wagon and did not is not a man I am afraid to trust." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had miscalculated. "All right," he said. He rode her to within half a mile of Springer's Main Street and waited in the scrub cedar at the base of a low mesa, while she walked into town with her carpet bag over one arm and her chin up and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. Marshal Hollis Crane was a compact man in his early 50s, with a gray beard trimmed close and the kind of eyes that had seen enough not to be surprised by anything. He listened to Sallie without interrupting for 30 minutes, examined the papers she unpicked from the lining of her carpet bag with a look of deepening attention, and then asked her 2 questions. The first was whether she was certain the records were accurate. She told him she had cross-referenced them against 3 years of her father's bank statements, which she had also brought, and that yes, she was certain. The second question was about the partner. She told him about Andrew. She did not soften the facts of his past, because she had decided on the walk into town that Marshal Crane was not a man who would be well served by softened facts, and also because she had the conviction, which surprised her somewhat, that Andrew's true facts did not require softening to make a case for him. Crane listened to all of it and then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Tell him to come in after dark," Crane said. "Around the back. Tell him to bring everything he has. And tell him that if what he has is as useful as you say, we can talk about what kind of arrangements might be made. But I will need to see him in person to make any commitments." Sallie walked back out of Springer into the scrub cedar with her heart still hammering, but for different reasons now, and she told Andrew what Crane had said, and she watched something she could only describe as relief move across his face like water across dry stone. "All right," he said again, and she was beginning to understand that this was what he said when something mattered too much to risk more words. They waited through the day in the scrub cedar with the horses and whatever was left of Andrew's provisions and a great deal of careful, quiet conversation. She told him about her plan for after if there was an after. She wanted to go back to Dodge City, sell what was left of her father's property, and use the money to start something new, somewhere west and clean. She had been thinking about Colorado, she said. She had heard the land around the Arkansas River was good. He told her that he had a brother in Texas he had not spoken to in 4 years, that he thought about writing to him sometimes, that he did not quite know what he would say. "You would say you are sorry and that you have been an idiot," she said, "because that is what people say after 4 years of silence, and it is usually true." He smiled at that. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it changed his face entirely, and she looked away quickly because the effect of it was more than she had anticipated. At dusk they rode into Springer together. She had thought she might need to talk him into allowing her to come with him rather than waiting somewhere safe, but he had not suggested she wait anywhere. He had simply looked at her and waited, and she had swung up behind him on horse without further discussion, and they had ridden in together. Marshal Crane met them at the back door of his office on the cross street behind the main avenue. He looked at Andrew for a long moment in the lantern light before he said anything. "You are younger than your poster suggests," Crane said. "I am 27, Andrew said. "Come inside." The meeting lasted 2 hours. Andrew laid out everything he had, which was more specific and operational in detail than Sallie's documentary evidence. The routes Driscoll's men used, the names of intermediaries, the particulars of how the stolen goods were moved through the territory. Crane took notes. He asked precise questions. He refilled everyone's coffee from a pot on the wood stove in the corner at regular intervals, which Sallie found inexplicably reassuring, because a man who kept his guests supplied with coffee during a negotiation was a man who intended the negotiation to continue to a conclusion. At the end of the 2 hours, Crane set down his pen, aligned his notes with the edge of the desk, and told Andrew that he was prepared to send a message north to the federal district office in Denver with a request for formal consideration of Andrew's cooperation. That this process would take time. That in the meantime Andrew would need to remain available, but also, given the nature of the situation, it would be advisable for him to remain less than conspicuous in or around Springer. "There is a piece of land north of town," Crane said. "A claim that belongs to an old man named Garfield who went north to his sister's family in the spring and has not come back. He left his horses with the livery. The cabin is empty. It would do for a few weeks while I sort out the mechanics of this arrangement." Andrew looked at him. "And what is the guarantee that this is not simply a very comfortable way of confining me until you decide to arrest me anyway?" Crane met his gaze without flinching. "None," he said, "except my word, and the fact that if I wanted to arrest you I could have done it 10 minutes ago and not bothered with the coffee." Andrew was quiet for a moment, then he nodded. "There is the additional matter of Miss Boone's safety," Crane said. "Driscoll will have people looking for those papers. The ambush on the road suggests he already knows she left Dodge City with something he wants. She cannot stay at the hotel, too exposed." "She can stay at the cabin," Andrew said very quickly, and then appeared to immediately reconsider the speed with which he had said it. "If she is agreeable, it has more than one room. It is safer than anywhere in town." Sallie looked at him. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something behind his eyes that was not entirely neutral, and she recognized it because she had been managing something very similar behind her own eyes for most of the past 12 hours. "That is agreeable," she said. "The cabin north of Springer was small but solidly built, which told you something about old Garfield, who had apparently believed in doing things properly even when there was no one watching. It sat on a low rise above the Cimarron River, with a view that in the early mornings was almost painful in its clarity. The mesa country going blue and gold and rose in the light, the river a thin silver thread below. There were 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen and a wood stove that drew well. The horses went in the small corral behind. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles south. They settled into it with the matter-of-fact practicality of 2 people who understood that the situation had stripped away the normal social scaffolding and left them with only the actual business of surviving day to day. and that this was, in its way, simpler and cleaner than most of the arrangements life ordinarily required. She cooked. He split wood and kept the corral in order, and rode out twice a week to meet with Crane at a predetermined spot 3 miles down the road, receiving updates on the progress of the situation in Denver, and watching the approaches to town for any sign of Driscoll's men. They were careful with each other. At first, the way two people are careful when they understand that something is happening between them that neither of them has properly thought through yet, and that requires, therefore, a certain amount of circumspection. But the land did not permit much circumspection. The cabin was small, and the days were long, and the work of staying alive in a remote place in the New Mexico Territory in the autumn of 1882 was fundamentally communal. You could not maintain elaborate distance from someone when you were sharing a wood stove and the last of the coffee, and the particular intimacy of long evenings with nothing but firelight and each other. She found herself watching him when he did not know she was watching. The careful, economical way he moved, which she had first noticed during those 4 miles across the dark desert when he had carried her weight without complaint and navigated by stars she could barely see. He was not a large man exactly, but he was solidly made, and there was a precision to how he inhabited space that she found, involuntarily, difficult to stop noticing. He had a habit, when he was thinking hard about something, of turning a small flat stone over and over in his right hand. He had found the stone on the riverbank 2 days after they arrived. She did not think he knew he did it. He watched her too. She knew this because she was good at knowing when she was being watched, a skill she had developed as the only child in a house where the adults around her had frequently underestimated her attentiveness, and also because when she caught him at it, his expression went carefully neutral in a way that confirmed rather than denied what she had observed. On the 6th evening at the cabin, while they were eating the rabbit stew she had made with the 2 rabbits he had snared that morning, he said without preamble, "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I am not entirely sure. Someone more frightened, perhaps. Someone who needed more managing." She looked at him levelly. "I was frightened. I am frightened. I am simply not constituted in a way that expresses fright as helplessness." "No," he said, "I noticed that. Is that a problem?" "No," he said with the small, slight smile she had begun to catalogue without meaning to. "It is extremely not a problem." She looked back down at her stew. The wood stove ticked and settled. Outside, the wind was moving through the scrub cedar in a sound like breathing. "You said that first night," she said carefully, "that you want a future. That you are trying to build one. What does that look like to you, the future you want?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had asked too much. "Ordinary," he said finally. "I want something ordinary. I want land, something to take care of, something that does not require me to be looking over my shoulder every minute." He paused. "I have not let myself think about it very specifically because for a long time it did not seem particularly likely. It seems more likely now." "Yes, it does." He looked at her directly. "It seems considerably more likely than it did 3 weeks ago." The way he said it made it clear that he was not talking only about land. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something complicated, and she was not quite ready to name it, but she was not afraid of it. That was the thing she noticed most. For a woman who had been afraid of so many things for so many months, the feeling that was spreading through her chest when she looked at Andrew Underwood was not one of them. "You should write to your brother," she said. He looked at her. "In Texas, you should write to him." "I told you I did not know what to say. I gave you the words. You say you are sorry and that you have been an idiot. That is enough to start." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Will you help me write it?" "Yes," she said. "Of course." They wrote the letter to his brother that night, the 2 of them at the small table by the lantern, their heads closed together over the paper, his handwriting careful and deliberate as a man who had not written many letters, her suggestions quiet and specific. When it was done, he read it through twice. "It is better than I could have written alone," he said. "It is yours," she said. "I only helped with the arrangement." He looked at the letter for another moment, then folded it carefully. "Will you tell me about your mother?" he said. "You said she taught you to read. I would like to hear more about her." And so she did. She talked about her mother for a long time, about a woman named Ruth Boone who had grown up dirt poor in Missouri and made herself educated by sheer stubborn will, and had given every bit of that will to her daughter, who had been told her whole life by the world at large that will was not particularly useful in a woman, and had spent that same lifetime demonstrating that the world at large was incorrect on this particular point. He listened the way he listened to everything she said, with complete attention, his dark eyes on her face, the flat stone turning over and over in his hand. She noticed that night that she was happy. Not the tentative, fragile kind of happy that comes when a situation is merely less terrible than it was before. The real kind. The solid kind that sits in your chest like something reliable and does not require conditions. The happiness frightened her slightly, because she was a practical woman who understood that the situation was not yet resolved, that Driscoll was still out there, that Denver had not yet responded, that everything could still go wrong in any number of directions. But it was there regardless, stubborn as Ruth Boone's daughter, and she stopped trying to reason it away and simply let it be. 2 weeks into their stay at the cabin, the situation escalated. Marshal Crane sent word through the prearranged contact point that a man had come into Springer asking about a woman traveling alone from Dodge City, asking very specifically. The man's name was Whitmore, and Whitmore worked for Cutter Driscoll, and Whitmore had brought 2 other men with him, and Crane's professional opinion was that the 3 of them were not in Springer to negotiate. Andrew got this news at the 3-mile meeting point, and rode back to the cabin at a pace that alarmed Sallie when she heard horse coming, because she had learned in 2 weeks to read the sound of that animal's gait, and what she was hearing was not a man returning from a routine ride. He told her everything before he had fully dismounted. She listened, standing in the cabin doorway with her arms folded, her face going very still the way it went when she was thinking fast. "He found me faster than I expected," she said. "He must have had someone watching the roads out of Dodge City, someone who saw which stage I took. We need to move you. We need to think this through before we move me anywhere," she said. "If Whitmore is looking for a woman traveling alone, then the safest place I can be is somewhere where I am clearly not traveling alone." He looked at her. "There is a woman in Springer," she said, "who takes in boarders, Mrs. Adelaida Vasquez. I spoke with her when I first arrived in town. She is a widow. Her house is on the quieter end of the main street. I could go there openly as myself as a woman who came to Springer for legitimate purposes and is staying temporarily. Whitmore is looking for someone who is hiding. A woman openly boarding with a respectable widow is not what he is looking for. You would be in town, in Springer, where Whitmore is. Where Crane is also," she said. "And where I have the best chance of being near help if I need it." She paused. "Also, Andrew, you cannot come into town, you know that. If Whitmore is Driscoll's man, there is a reasonable chance he knows your face. Being seen with me in town would make everything worse." He did not like it. She could see that plainly. The muscle in his jaw was working, and he was staring at her with an expression that she recognized now as the face he made when he was fighting the urge to simply solve a problem by taking it over, which was a tendency she had noticed in him and liked him for resisting. "I do not like it," he said. "I know, but it is the right strategy. If anything happens to you, I will send word to Crane immediately if anything feels wrong. I have the signal agreed." She looked at him steadily. "I have been managing dangerous situations alone since March, Andrew. I am good at it." He looked at her for a long, unreadable moment. "I know you are," he said. "That is not the problem." Something in the way he said it made her breath catch. "Tell me what the problem is," she said quietly. He looked away, out across the scrub and the low hills toward the gleam of the river. When he looked back at her, his expression had changed into something more open than she had seen from him before, something more unguarded. "The problem," he said carefully, "is that I have spent the last 2 weeks understanding that you are the most important person in my life, and you have been in it for 2 weeks, and I cannot figure out what to do with that." The silence between them was the kind that has weight to it. "You could start," she said, "by not making it sound like a problem." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and she met him halfway, and when he kissed her, it was nothing like careful. It was 2 weeks of careful catching fire all at once, and she put her hands against his chest and felt his heart hammering under her palms and thought, with the part of her mind that never quite stopped observing, "There it is. There is the thing I have been not naming." They stood there in the cabin doorway in the thin Colorado autumn light for a long moment. Then she stepped back and looked at him, and he looked at her, and they were both, for once, entirely without things to say. "I have to go to Springer," she said finally. "I know. This is not over." "No," he said. "It is the opposite of over." She rode into Springer on horse, which Andrew lent her without being asked, and found Mrs. Adelaida Vasquez, who was a stout, warm, immovable woman in her 50s who had survived the death of a husband, the raising of 3 sons largely alone, and the Maxwell land grant wars, and who had therefore developed a finely calibrated sense for when a young woman needed safe harbor without being asked too many questions. She gave Sallie a room at the back of the house, showed her where the kitchen was, introduced her to her youngest son Ernesto, who was 15 and serious, and assigned himself the task of carrying Sally's carpet bag up the stairs with an expression of great responsibility, and then made her sit down and eat a bowl of the best postle Sallie had ever tasted. Sallie watched through the kitchen window while she ate. She watched the street. She was looking for men who were looking too hard at things. She found Whitmore the next morning. He was exactly as Crane had described him. A lean, pale man in a dark coat who stood on the corner of the main street and watched the foot traffic with the focused patience of a man who is paid to be patient. He had a deputized-looking quality about him that was the most dangerous kind of false, the kind designed to make people less vigilant than they ought to be. Sallie walked past him twice that morning on ordinary errands, and he looked at her both times and did not register her as significant, which confirmed that the strategy was working. She was simply a woman in town, nothing notable. She sent word to Crane through the agreed method, which involved a certain arrangement of goods in the window of the dry goods store on the cross street, and Crane came to Mrs. Vasquez's house that evening ostensibly to call on the widow and in actuality to compare notes. Crane told her that Denver had sent a preliminary response. They were interested. They needed 2 more weeks to arrange the operational details. He needed her and Andrew to stay available and stay hidden for 2 more weeks. 2 more weeks. She sent the same information to Andrew through a method they had arranged before she left the cabin, a note folded into a particular configuration and left at the hollow of a specific cedar tree 3 miles north of town, where he would check each morning at dawn. The note he sent back the following morning said only, 2 weeks. "I will be here. Are you all right?" She wrote back, "Yes, I am all right. Take care of horse." She thought about adding something else, and decided the situation did not yet call for complete transparency by letter, given that letters could be found. She managed Springer and Whitmore with a steadiness that she found slightly remarkable when she examined it from the outside. She went about the ordinary business of a woman temporarily settled in a town. She helped Mrs. Vasquez with the household. She bought thread from the dry goods store. She spoke to people on the street in the pleasant, unrevealing way of someone who is simply passing through. She was warm and present and completely impenetrable. Inside, she was counting the hours. On the 5th day of her stay in Springer, Whitmore's companion, a thick-shouldered man named Pell, made a mistake. He started asking questions at the hotel about a woman who had come from Dodge City, specifically, alone, with a carpet bag. The hotel owner, a man named Harkins who had extensive relationships with everyone in Springer and very specific views about men who came into his establishment behaving like hired investigators, mentioned this inquiry to approximately 6 people in the course of the afternoon. One of those 6 people was Ernesto Vasquez, who was at the hotel with a delivery from his mother. Ernesto came home and told his mother. His mother came quietly to Sally's room and told her. Sallie put on her hat and walked straight to Crane's office. Crane listened and then, with the unhurried decisiveness of a man who has managed crises long enough to have distilled the process to its essentials, sent a message north to Andrew. The situation was accelerating. He needed to come in, risk be damned, but carefully after dark, and they needed to move the timeline. Andrew came in that night. He arrived at the back of Crane's office at 10 o'clock with his hat pulled low and his collar up, and Sallie was already there. And when he walked through the door and saw her sitting at Crane's desk, she felt something that was not quite relief but was close to it, something warmer and more particular than relief. He stopped when he saw her, and his face did the thing it did, the careful thing that he did not fully manage to complete before she saw what was underneath it. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. "Sit down. Crane has news." Crane's news was this. Denver had moved faster than expected because someone at the federal level had already been building a case against Driscoll and was very interested in what Crane had sent north. A deputy marshal was coming south from Raton with authorization to take formal statements and to provide protection for cooperative witnesses. He would arrive in 4 days. 4 days. Whitmore and Pell had 3 men in Springer now and were clearly narrowing their search. Crane needed Andrew and Sallie somewhere safe for 4 days. "The cabin," Andrew said. "Both of you," Crane confirmed. "Together. I know that is an unconventional arrangement. It is fine," Sallie said, simultaneously with Andrew saying it is perfectly appropriate. And they looked at each other sideways in a way that made Crane, who was a perceptive man, examine the ceiling for a moment with tremendous interest. They went back to the cabin that night, riding double on horse through the dark with the stars enormous overhead and the cold biting at their faces, and Sallie did not pretend she was not glad to be there. Those 4 days at the cabin were, Sallie thought later, when she was old enough to look back at her life with the kind of clear vision that distance permits, the 4 most important days of her life. Not because of what happened in terms of events, which were largely unremarkable from the outside, but because of what happened between them during those 4 days, which was the quiet, complete, irreversible thing that happens when 2 people stop negotiating the terms of their own feelings and simply allow those feelings to exist in full. They talked. They talked more than she had talked to anyone in years, possibly ever, about things that mattered and things that did not, about her father and his brother and Colorado and Texas, and what land looked like in the early morning, and what they both wanted their lives to contain. He told her about books he had read, carried and traded among men who lived rough and valued them accordingly, books that had surprised her by the breadth of them, novels and histories, and one very battered volume of poetry by Walt Whitman that he had carried for 3 years, and that he now showed her with a kind of sheepish precision that she found deeply affecting. She read him passages from the Whitman while he sat across from her by the wood stove and turned his flat stone over and over. She had a good reading voice, her mother's gift to her, and she read slowly enough to mean it. On the second night he told her he loved her. He said it the way he said everything important, without preamble and without decoration, looking at her directly as though he had decided that the only dignified option was honesty at full volume. "I love you, Sallie Boone," he said. "I understand that this is a complicated and poorly timed thing to say, given that our circumstances are not yet fully resolved and I have, technically, an outstanding warrant in Colorado, but I think you should know it regardless because I have found that keeping things back from you tends to be a futile exercise anyway." She set down the Whitman very carefully. "Andrew," she said, "yes, I love you too. I have loved you since the night in the relay station, I think, though I was not prepared to admit it at the time because I had other priorities." He looked at her with an expression so unguarded it made her chest ache. "The stone," she said, "the one you turn over in your hand when you are thinking. You have been turning it all evening." He looked down at his hand as though he had forgotten it was there. "You notice everything," he said. "Habit," she said. "Come here." He came to her and she took his face in her hands and looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the exact quality of this moment, the wood stove light and the smell of cedar and the particular dark of his eyes, and then she kissed him with the full weight of everything she felt, which was considerable. They stayed like that for a long time, and when they finally drew apart, his forehead was against hers and they were both very quiet. "When this is finished," he said. "When this is finished," she agreed. The deputy marshal arrived in Springer on the morning of the fourth day. A solid, official-looking man named Beaumont from the Denver district office, and everything moved quickly after that in the way things do when institutional machinery, once engaged, has the proper fuel. They came into Springer together, Sallie and Andrew, riding horse through the main street in full daylight, which was either brave or reckless depending on your perspective, and Sallie thought it was probably some of both. Whitmore saw them from his corner post. He put his hand toward his coat. Marshal Crane stepped out of his office doorway before Whitmore's hand completed its journey, and Deputy Marshal Beaumont stepped out behind him, and the two men's collective authority was sufficiently visible that Whitmore reconsidered his options and stood very still instead. The formal proceedings took the better part of 2 days. Beaumont took Sallie's statement first, all of it, everything in the papers and everything she knew beyond the papers, with a thoroughness that was impressive and an evident understanding of exactly what her evidence meant in the context of the broader federal investigation he was conducting. He took Andrew's statement second, for 3 hours, and at the end of those 3 hours he told Andrew, plainly and without embellishment, that the cooperation he had provided was, in combination with the documentary evidence, sufficient for the federal district to support a formal application for clemency with respect to the charges outstanding in Colorado. That this would require him to remain available and possibly to testify at federal proceedings against Driscoll, but that Beaumont's assessment was that the application would be approved. Andrew received this information with such complete stillness that Sallie, watching from the other side of the room, crossed to him and took his hand because she understood what that stillness meant. He looked down at their joined hands. Then he looked at her. "Ordinary," he said quietly. "Ordinary," she said back. Cutter Driscoll was arrested by federal marshals in Santa Fe 3 weeks later. The case against him was substantial. The combination of Sallie's documentary evidence and Andrew's operational testimony, added to the existing federal investigation, was more than sufficient. Whitmore and Pell were taken into custody in Springer the same day Driscoll was arrested in Santa Fe, which had been coordinated deliberately, and which made Sallie feel, when Crane told her, a satisfaction so complete it was almost physical. She was in Mrs. Vasquez's kitchen when she heard the news, drinking coffee and helping Adelaida prepare tortillas, which she had been learning because Adelaida had decided to teach her regardless of whether she had asked, which Sallie had appreciated enormously. When Crane came through the kitchen door with his hat in his hand and told her it was done, she set down the rolling pin and pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed. "Done," she said. "Done," Crane said. "All of it." Andrew was in Springer by that afternoon. He had been staying at the Garfield cabin since the statement proceedings were finished, working the place and waiting, and Crane had sent word north as soon as the news came in from Santa Fe. He arrived at Mrs. Vasquez's house with horse and his saddlebags, and a look on his face that Sallie had never seen before, a lightness, as though something that had been pressing on him for years had simply lifted. Adelaida Vasquez looked at him when he came through the door. Then she looked at Sallie. Then she looked at Crane with an expression that said she had understood this situation perfectly from the beginning and had simply been waiting for everyone involved to catch up. "Sit," she told Andrew. "There is coffee." He sat, and he and Sallie looked at each other across the width of Adelaida's kitchen, and Sallie thought that she had never in her life seen a man who looked so thoroughly as though he was exactly where he wanted to be. "So," he said. "So," she said, "I would like to ask you something." "Yes," she said before he had finished saying it. He blinked. "You do not know what I was going to ask." "I know exactly what you were going to ask, Andrew, and the answer is yes." Crane suddenly became very interested in a point on the far wall. Adelaida, whose English was somewhat selective, missed nothing. Andrew stood up from the table and crossed to her and took both her hands in his and looked at her with those dark, unguarded eyes. "I want to build something," he said, "with you. Something ordinary and permanent and good. I want land and a life, and I want to do it right this time. All of it right." He paused. "I am asking you to marry me, Sallie Boone. I am asking you to marry me and help me figure out what ordinary looks like for two people who have had very little of it." She looked at him for a long, deliberate moment, the way she had looked at him that first night in the relay station, when she was deciding whether he was what he seemed. And this time, like that time, what she found looking back at her was the same, true, entirely and undeniably true. "Yes," she said. "I already told you yes." He kissed her in Adelaida Vasquez's kitchen, while Holly's crane continued to examine the far wall, and Adelaida made a sound of such profound satisfaction that Ernesto, passing through from the yard, leaned in to see what had happened, and then retreated with the expression of a 15-year-old who has stumbled into something that is not for him. They were married in Springer in December of 1882, in the small church on the north end of the main street, with Marshall Crane standing up as a witness, and Adelaida Vasquez seated in the front row, wearing her best black dress and weeping with controlled dignity. Ernesto sat beside his mother, holding himself together with the effort of a young man who intended to maintain composure and was mostly succeeding. The letter Andrew had written to his brother in Texas had, by some grace, reached its destination and received a reply. His brother, a man named James Underwood who ran a small horse operation outside of Waco, had written back in a handwriting that looked just like Andrew's and said, in somewhat more words than Andrew would have used but to the same effect, "Yes, of course, I have been waiting, you idiot." He could not come to the wedding, the distance being what it was, but the letter was on the table during the ceremony in a way that felt like presents. Sallie wore a dress that Adelaida had helped her make from fabric bought at the dry goods store, dark blue wool that was practical and warm and beautiful in the way that practical things can be when they are made with care. Andrew wore his best coat, which was not very fancy but was clean and fitted well on his shoulders, and he stood at the front of that small church and watched her walk toward him with an expression so open and certain that three people in the pews who did not know either of them found their eyes going warm. She reached him and took his hands, and they looked at each other. "Ready?" she said quietly, too low for anyone else to hear. "Yes," he said, with the certainty of a man who has never been more sure of anything in his life. The clemency application from the Federal District Office in Denver arrived in February of 1883, approved, as Beaumont had predicted it would be. Cutter Driscoll was formally indicted in federal court that same month, and his trial was set for the spring. Andrew's testimony was taken in deposition form by Beaumont, given that travel to Denver in February was difficult, and Beaumont had assessed correctly that what they had in writing was more than sufficient without requiring Andrew's physical presence in the courtroom. Driscoll was convicted in March of 1883. The sentence was 20 years in federal prison. The judge, reading the verdict, noted that the evidence presented was among the most comprehensive and damning he had seen in his tenure, and that the cooperation of witnesses had been instrumental. He did not name them. He did not need to. Sallie read about the conviction in a newspaper 3 weeks after it happened, sitting on the front step of the house they had found north of Springer, the small stone house they were renting while they figured out their next move. She read it twice. Then she folded the paper carefully and set it on the step beside her and sat for a moment in the early spring light, feeling the particular quality of a thing that is truly finished. Andrew came around the side of the house from the direction of the corral, where he had been doing something practical with fence posts, and stopped when he saw her face. "It is done," she said. He crossed the yard and sat down beside her on the step and looked at the folded newspaper and then at her. All of it, 20 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his arm around her and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the spring light without talking for a long time, which was one of the things she had come to love best about being with him. The way silence between them was never empty. "Colorado," he said eventually. She lifted her head. "Yes. I want to show you something. There is land I know about along the Arkansas River south of Pueblo. It is exactly what you described that night in the relay station. Good land, clean. The kind of land you could build on properly." She looked at him. "You went and looked at it. I made a trip a few weeks ago while you were at Adelaide's for that week." He had the slight, self-contained expression of a man who has been waiting to say something and is somewhat pleased by how it is landing. "Andrew Underwood," she said. "Sallie Underwood," he corrected, gently but with precision. She felt the warmth of that move through her like something physical. She had been Sallie Boone for 24 years, and she was Sallie Underwood now, and she thought that both names were true and that this was, perhaps, the best version of true there was. "Tell me about the land," she said. He told her. He told her about the river bottom where the grass grew thick in spring, about the stand of cottonwoods along the eastern edge of the property, about the view to the west where the mountains stood up out of the plains like something reliable. He told her about the house that was on it, modest but sound, and the barn, and the water access, and the neighbor a mile and a half south who was, by all evidence, the uncomplicated kind of neighbor who kept to themselves and waved when they saw you. She listened to all of it with her eyes on his face and the spring light on both of them. "How much?" she said. He named a price. She calculated quickly. Her father's house in Dodge City had sold the previous autumn, the proceeds sent through a lawyer she had worked with through Crane's contacts. Between what she had from the sale and what Andrew had managed to accumulate through honest work over the winter, they were not far off. "We would need a loan for the balance," she said. "Crane has offered to stand guarantor with the land bank in Springer. As a favor," she smiled. "He is a remarkably useful man." "He is," Andrew agreed. "He also said, when I thanked him, that he was glad to have met us both, which I think is as close as Crane gets to sentiment." They left Springer in April of 1883, with horse and a second horse Andrew had acquired over the winter, a gray mare named Petra who Sallie had claimed as her own without consultation, and to whom Andrew raised no objection, and a wagon with their belongings and the beginnings of a household. Adelaida Vasquez came out to see them off with Ernesto beside her, and she embraced Sallie with the thoroughness of a woman who does not do things halfway, and told her in the mixture of Spanish and English she used when feeling things strongly that she was welcome back any time and that she expected letters. Marshal Crane shook Andrew's hand on the main street of Springer with both of his, which was unusual for Crane, and told him he had done all right. It took them 3 weeks to travel north to the Arkansas River land, through country that was sometimes beautiful and sometimes hard and always entirely real. They camped each night and cooked over open fires and talked in the way they had been talking for months now, easily and at length about everything and nothing, and Sallie lay under the enormous western sky each night and felt the shape of her life arranging itself into something she recognized as right. The property in Colorado was everything Andrew had described and more. She stood on the rise above the river the first morning after they arrived, in the early light with the mountains going gold to the west, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for longer than she could precisely calculate. Andrew came to stand beside her. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, his shoulder against hers, looking at the same thing she was looking at. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he agreed. The next 2 years were work which they were both constitutionally suited to. They built the household properly, room by room and season by season, enlarging what was there and improving it and making it theirs. Andrew worked the land with a focus and commitment that the neighboring farmer, whose name was Beauchamp, and who was indeed the uncomplicated waving kind, observed with approval and commented on occasionally when they met on the road. Sallie kept a kitchen garden and managed the household accounts with the same precise intelligence she had applied to her father's ledger books, and the account stayed consistently on the right side of the ledger, because she was good at understanding numbers and better at understanding where the inefficiencies were. She also, in the second year, began teaching reading to 3 children from the Beauchamp family and 2 others from further down the road, because there was no school within practical distance, and the want of one was apparent. She did this once a week on Saturday mornings in the kitchen of the stone house on the river, using the books she had collected and her mother's method, and she found it deeply satisfying in the way that things are satisfying when they connect you to someone you have loved. Andrew wrote to James in Texas. James wrote back. The correspondence was irregular but consistent, and it had the quality of 2 men who are both somewhat unaccustomed to emotional vocabulary working their way slowly toward the territory where it lived. By the second year, Andrew had told his brother about the land and the work, and James had told Andrew about the horse operation and his wife, a woman named Clara, and their 2 boys. By the third year they were writing with something that, if you held it at the right angle, looked distinctly like closeness. In the spring of 1884, Sallie told Andrew she was expecting a child. She told him the way she told him most important things, directly and without ceremony, over breakfast at the kitchen table while he was looking at the account books she had kept, and he went absolutely still in a way that she had learned to read as the highest register of feeling he had. Then he put the account books down very carefully and looked at her. "Sallie," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been calculating. Late November, possibly early December." He stood up and came around the table and took her hands and pulled her to standing and held her there, both of them standing in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the sound of the river below, and she felt him breathe very deliberately, the way a man breathes when he is trying to hold something enormous without spilling it. "I am not frightened," she said, because she had learned with him that it was important to name what she was actually feeling rather than what the situation seemed to call for. "I am happy. I am very happy." "So am I," he said into her hair. "I am extraordinarily happy. I am also frightened. Both are true simultaneously." She laughed and held him tighter. Their son was born in late November of 1884. In the stone house on the Arkansas River, with a midwife named Mrs. Ortega who came from the settlement 4 miles south, and who was calm and competent in the way of someone who has done a difficult thing so many times it has become a kind of art. The labor was long, and Andrew sat outside the bedroom door for 7 hours, being completely useless in the way that men are in these circumstances, which Sallie was aware of and found privately touching. When Mrs. Ortega finally opened the door and told him he could come in, he entered the room with the particular careful quality of a large person trying very hard not to disturb anything, and found Sallie propped against the pillows, exhausted and disheveled, and more beautiful to him than anything he had words for, holding a small, red-faced person who was making the particular sounds of someone deeply unimpressed with their new surroundings. "Come here," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and he looked down at the child with an expression that was nothing like anything she had seen on his face before, something entirely new, layered and overwhelmed and absolutely certain all at once. "He looks furious," Andrew said. "All babies look furious," Mrs. Ortega said from the doorway, with the serenity of someone who knows this to be true. "He will get over it." "Thomas," Sallie said. "I would like to name him Thomas." Andrew looked at her. He understood immediately because he always understood, and his expression shifted into something tender and exact. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Underwood." He looked down at the baby. "Hello, Thomas. We are your parents. We are doing our best." Thomas Ortega Underwood, as his baptismal record would eventually show, with the additional middle name added in honor of the midwife who had brought him safely into the world, turned out to be an extremely opinionated child who got over his initial fury with remarkable speed, and proceeded to be interested in everything around him with an intensity that his mother recognized immediately, and his father found both admirable and exhausting. James and Clara Underwood came up from Texas the following spring to meet their nephew, a trip of some considerable effort and distance that said, more clearly than any letter had managed, what the Underwood brothers actually felt about each other. James was older than Andrew by 3 years, broader across the chest, with the same dark eyes and a laugh that came more easily. Clara was a small, direct woman from Georgia who sized up Sallie in approximately 4 minutes and declared, with simple conviction, that she was very glad her brother-in-law had found her. The two families stayed for 2 weeks, sleeping in the stone house in the barn, and generally filling the property with a noise and activity that Andrew found somewhat chaotic and Sallie found entirely wonderful. James and Andrew worked side by side in the fields for the first 3 days without talking very much, and then on the 4th day talked for what appeared to be most of the afternoon, leaning against the corral fence, which Sallie observed from the kitchen window and did not interrupt. That evening Andrew came in for supper with the look of a man who has set down something heavy after carrying it a very long time. "All right?" she asked. "All right," he said. And then, with the flat stone turning over and over in his hand, he smiled at her. By 1886, the small Saturday school in Sallie's kitchen had outgrown the kitchen. There were 11 children coming regularly from 4 miles in every direction, and she had written twice to the Territorial Education Office about the possibility of a formal schoolhouse, and had received, on the 2nd attempt, a response that was more than a form letter. Andrew, who had been watching this campaign with the specific attention of a man who is deeply proud of his wife and knows better than to say so too often, built a single-room schoolhouse on the far edge of their property that spring, with help from Beauchamp and 2 other neighboring men, and Sallie stood in the door of it when it was finished and put her hands on her hips and said, with great satisfaction, "Good." Thomas was 18 months old and had opinions about the schoolhouse already, primarily that it was an interesting place that he should be allowed to enter at will, which his father permitted him in the evenings when the students were gone, and which resulted in Thomas developing very early the habit of sitting in the teacher's chair and making pronouncements to the empty room. "He is going to be a lawyer," Sallie said once, watching this from the doorway. "Or a preacher," Andrew said. "The instincts are the same," she said. In the autumn of 1886, Sallie discovered she was expecting again. This one arrived in the spring of 1887, a girl this time, faster and more decisive about the whole business than her brother had been. They named her Ruth, for Ruth Boone, who had taught her daughter to read with borrowed books and sheer stubborn will, and Andrew held baby Ruth with the same overwhelmed certainty he had held Thomas with, and Thomas came to inspect his sister with the expression of a 2-year-old scientist encountering a new specimen. "Mine," Thomas said, pointing at the baby. "Yours," Andrew confirmed, with the solemnity the moment seemed to require. "Good," Thomas said, in exactly the tone his mother used when she had managed something to her satisfaction. The years layered on each other with the texture of real things, seasons and harvests, and the particular rhythms of a life built rather than found. The school became a genuine institution, officially recognized by the Territorial Education Authority, with Sallie as its certified teacher under provisions that had recently been extended in the territory to permit women of demonstrated qualification. She taught with the precision and warmth of someone for whom teaching is a form of love, and the children who came to her on the river road grew up knowing how to read and think, which was the gift her mother had given her, and that she gave outward in all directions. Andrew became, over those years, the thing he had said he wanted to be, a man of the land. He expanded the property gradually, purchased additional acreage as it became available, kept cattle and horses with a careful eye on the market and the seasons, and developed a reputation in the county as a man whose word was reliable. He served for 2 years on the County Land Commission, a role that suited him because it required both the practical understanding he had and the kind of straightforward honesty that had always been, underneath everything, his nature. Nobody in the county knew the full history of Andrew Underwood. They knew he had come from the New Mexico Territory, that he had a wife from Kansas who ran the best school in 2 counties, that he had a son and a daughter and a well-kept property on the Arkansas River, and that he was the kind of neighbor who showed up when you needed help without being asked. That was enough. Andrew had come to understand, more than enough. It was everything. He still had the flat stone. It sat on the windowsill above the kitchen table, worn smooth by years of his hands, and sometimes Sallie would pick it up when she was thinking and turn it over, and he would notice and not say anything. Just watch her with the particular expression she had catalogued the whole stone from the river to now, which was love. In the autumn of 1888, they received a letter from Hollis Crane, who had retired from the marshal service in the spring and was, he said, living with his daughter's family in Albuquerque, which he found agreeable. He wrote to inform them that he had been contacted by a journalist in Denver who was writing about the Driscoll case for a national magazine, about the role of cooperative witnesses in federal prosecutions, and that the journalist had asked for names. Crane had declined to provide them, as he thought the Underwoods had earned their privacy, but he wanted them to know the inquiry had been made. He also wrote that he thought about their kitchen in Springer sometimes, which he was not entirely sure made sense to report but which was true, and that he hoped they were well. They wrote back together, the 2 of them at the kitchen table as they had written Andrew's letter to his brother 5 years before, heads bent over the paper. Sallie wrote most of it because she was faster and more fluid, but Andrew contributed specifics, the names and ages of the children, the news of the school, a paragraph about the land that season. They told Crane they were glad he was in Albuquerque and hoped his daughter was well and thanked him for the privacy, which they both valued enormously. Andrew wrote the last line himself. Hollis, you stood up for 2 people who had very little standing at the time, and we have not forgotten it and we are living well. Thank you. Crane wrote back the following month. His letter was short. It said, good. That is what I hoped for. He had enclosed, folded into the letter, a small clipping from a Springer newspaper reporting the opening of the new school library at the Springer Town School, noting at the bottom of the clipping in his precise handwriting, I thought of you. They framed the clipping and put it on the wall of the schoolhouse. Thomas grew into a boy of such specific and energetic intelligence that managing him required, Sallie sometimes thought, more strategic thinking than the entirety of the Driscoll situation had. He read everything he could find, which meant that by the time he was 6 the available books in the school and the house had been exhausted, and Andrew had made a special trip to Pueblo to order more. Thomas met him at the gate when he came back with the books and cataloged them in approximately 15 minutes and began reading the first one before supper. Ruth was quieter, watchful, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's precise understanding of everything that was happening around her. She had a gift for drawing that neither parent could account for, and by the time she was 3, she was producing portraits of the household animals that were recognizable enough to occasion comment. Andrew put her drawings on the kitchen wall and added to the collection regularly, and would not hear of any of them being removed. In the spring of 1889, the Colorado Territory became the state of Colorado, a fact which Andrew marked by standing on the rise above the river with his hat in his hand and looking at the mountains and saying nothing in particular, which Sallie understood perfectly. You are a Colorado man now, she said. I have been a Colorado man, he said. Officially and unofficially, the state's position on the matter is simply catching up with the fact. She took his hand, and they stood there looking at the mountains until Thomas came running from the direction of the barn to report that one of the horses had gotten into something interesting and immediate parental attention was required. Andrew put his hat back on and they went to deal with what needed dealing with, which was, Sallie thought, perhaps the most accurate description of their life she could have composed. Going to deal with what needed dealing with together, which made all the difference. On the evening of their 7th wedding anniversary, in December of 1889, Andrew found Sallie sitting at the kitchen table with the flat stone from the windowsill in her hands, turning it over in the way she did when she was thinking. The children were in bed. The wood stove was burning. The house was quiet around them with the particular warmth of a well-built thing that has been well-loved. He sat down across from her and watched her. "What are you thinking about?" he said. She set the stone down between them on the table and looked at him. "That first night," she said, "in the relay station, you said those words, 7 words. I have thought about them many times since." "You do not have to be brave right now," he said. "Yes," she looked at the stone. "I have been brave every single minute since I was old enough to understand what bravery costs. Since my mother died, since my father's debts, all of it, I was always brave. I know. But that night when you said that, I understood something I had not understood before. That being brave does not mean not being afraid, and that sometimes when someone is there, you can put it down. You can just put the bravery down for a little while and simply be a person who is afraid and tired and alive." She looked up at him. "You gave me that night, and every day since." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she felt his thumb trace the knuckle of her first finger the way he did when he was saying something he could not quite find the words for. "You gave me the future I did not know how to see," he said quietly. "I told you that night in the relay station that I wanted something ordinary, and you helped me understand that ordinary, when you have the right person standing in it with you, is the most extraordinary thing there is." Outside, the Colorado winter was making its opinions known, whined off the mountains and the cold settling into the stone walls of the house, and the smoke from the wood stove going straight up into a clear sky full of stars. Inside, the house was warm and the children were sleeping, and the flat stone sat on the kitchen table between two people who had found each other in the dark on the Cimarron Road and decided, separately and then together, to trust the thread. Sallie picked up the stone and set it on her side of the table. "Mine," she said, with the same inflection Thomas had used when assessing his baby sister, and with the same certainty. Andrew laughed, and the sound of it filled the kitchen, and she thought that she would remember this sound, this exact quality of this sound, for the rest of her life. "Yours," he said, "obviously, as it has always been." She looked at him across the table with the wood stove ticking and the stars outside the window and 7 years of days and nights between them, and she felt what she had felt that first night in the relay station when he had given her the 7 words that unmade her and remade her, that feeling of being completely, exactly where she was supposed to be. "Come here," she said. He came to her as he always did, and she took his face in her hands, as she had done in that cabin north of Springer on the night he told her he loved her, and she looked at him for a long, deliberate moment. "I love you, Andrew Underwood," she said. "I loved you when you were an outlaw, and I love you now that you are a Colorado farmer with a schoolhouse on your property, and a son who talks too much and a daughter who draws horses on every available surface, and I will love you through everything that comes after this. I love you, Sallie Underwood," he said. "I loved you when you were under a wagon on the Cimarron Road fighting a man who was trying to rescue you, and I will love you through everything that comes after this." She kissed him, and the fire burned, and the house held them, and outside the mountains stood against the winter sky as they had always stood and would go on standing long after, patient and enormous and utterly reliable, the way some things are when they are made of the right material and put in the right place. In the spring of 1891, Sallie found she was expecting a 3rd child. Andrew received this news at the breakfast table with the same complete stillness, and then the same overwhelming expression he had produced on the previous 2 occasions, which she found as moving the 3rd time as the first. "You would think," she said, watching him, "that a man of your experience would have developed a less dramatic response to family news." "I disagree," he said. "This news warrants drama every time." The 3rd child, a boy, was born in October of 1891, and they named him James, for the brother in Texas, and they wrote to James and Clara the day he was born, and James's letter back was one of the few times in the correspondence between the brothers when the words were more than practical. He said that he was honored, and that Clara cried, and that he hoped young James Underwood would grow up to be half the man his father had become. Andrew read this letter on the front step of the house, with the mountains in front of him, and the October light on everything, and did not say anything for a long time. When he came inside, his eyes were slightly red, which he did not acknowledge, and Sallie did not comment on directly, only put a cup of coffee in his hand and stood beside him while he drank it. "He is a good man, your brother," she said. "He is," Andrew said. "We are both good men now. I did not always think that was possible." "I knew it was possible," Sallie said. "I knew it that first night." He looked at her. "How?" "Because a man who is not at his core good does not pull a stranger out from under a wagon in the dark. He calculates the risk and leaves her there." She set her hand against his chest over his heart. "You did not calculate. You just came. That is what a good man does." He covered her hand with his and held it there. Thomas, by this point 6 years old and fully operational as a person of strong views, greeted the arrival of his new brother with a mixture of proprietary enthusiasm and the faint suspicion of a person who has already navigated one addition to the household and has views about the process. He was deeply interested in the baby's name and spent several days calling him "my James," to distinguish him from the Texas James, which Sallie allowed because the logic was impeccable. Ruth drew a portrait of baby James on the 3rd day of his life that captured, somehow, the exact quality of his sleeping expression, and Andrew put it on the wall beside all the others and stood looking at it for a moment with an expression of quiet wonder. "She sees things," he said. "Yes," Sallie agreed. "She does. I wonder sometimes where that comes from." "Neither of us," Andrew said. "She is entirely her own." "The best ones are," Sallie said. The years continued. The schoolhouse gained a second room. Thomas went on to study law in Denver, as Sallie had suspected he would, and James followed him into law 10 years later, and Ruth went to art school in Chicago on a scholarship that the territory's educational foundation provided, which Sallie had advocated for quietly and effectively in the way she advocated for most things, without fanfare and with complete certainty. Ruth came back from Chicago with a different quality of silence about her, and an ability to see that had deepened into something that made people who saw her work feel that she had looked at something true. The flat stone sat on the kitchen windowsill for as long as Sallie lived in that house. She moved it to the bedroom windowsill when they enlarged the house in 1893, and it stayed there through everything. Through Thomas's departure and Ruth's and James's, through the seasons and the years, and the particular quiet of a house that has given its children to the world and knows it has done the thing it was for. In the evenings, long evenings, Colorado evenings with the mountains holding the last of the light, they sat together on the porch they had built on the south side of the house, Andrew with his coffee and Sallie with hers, and they watched the land they had built together in all its seasons, and talked or did not talk as the evening required. The flat stone was inside on its windowsill, but it was always there, the way some things are always there even when you cannot see them. There was a night many years on when they had been sitting on the porch for some time in comfortable silence, and the stars were beginning to come out above the mountains, and Andrew said without preamble, the way he always said the things that mattered most, "Do you ever think about the relay station?" "Often," she said. "Do you?" "Every day," he said. "I think about what would have happened if I had not ridden north, if I had stayed in the livery stable and decided it was not my problem." "You would not have done that," she said with certainty. "No," he agreed. "I would not have done that. I could not have. Something in me already knew, I think, before I understood it myself." He paused. "I think the word for what that something was is love, that it was already there ahead of understanding." She looked at him. In the fading light, his face was the same face she had first seen in the lantern glow of the ruined relay station, the scar and the dark eyes and the specific, undecorated honesty of him, and also not the same, layered now with all the years and all the days and all the things they had made and done and been together. "I think you are right," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the evening light, the two of them, in the life they had built from courage and catastrophe, and 7 words spoken in a broken-down station house in New Mexico in the autumn of 1882. "You do not have to be brave right now." It had been both a gift and a promise. She understood now, across all the years of looking at it from different angles. A gift in the moment, because she had been exhausted and terrified, and had needed above all else to be told that she was allowed to put the weight down. And a promise, though he had not known it when he said it, about the nature of what would follow, that she would never again have to carry things alone. That there would always be someone sitting with her through the long nights. That the bravery she had spent so many years at was now only the kind you choose rather than the kind you are forced to, which is an entirely different animal and much easier to live with. The stars came out fully above the mountains. Andrew squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, and the land lay all around them in the dark, theirs and tended and real, the most ordinary and extraordinary thing in the world.